This is an interview with Floyd Brooker, April 8th, 1975, as part of the ECT Foundation Oral History Project. Floyd, I'm very happy to be able to conduct this interview and get your experiences on tape for the benefit of the future leaders in the field. And speaking of the field, there really wasn't any field when you came into the business. You were one of the people who created the field. How did you get into the area of educational media, and what interested you in it?
Well, there's two stories that I can tell you. One of them was that when I was in the 8th grade of the elementary school, the manufacturer, the producer of some aptitude tests came through, and he tested us all in the 8th grade. And all the other kids got the areas in which their aptitudes lay, except me. And finally, at last, he called me up, and in the presence of the principal, he said, young man, he said, I don't know what this means, but my company is highly pleased with the result. Somewhere or another, it came out that you were going to go into the audiovisual field. Now, I don't have the slightest idea what this is nor what it means. It doesn't appear in any book, any place, but, and he was right. Now, this is a story I tell of people, but the real story is this. I would say that for 3 years I was a babysitter with 35 millimeter films. At McKinley High School in Canton, Ohio, we had a auditorium which seated 2,200 students, and that's where everybody ate their lunch. So each lunch hour, we would run one reel of a 35 millimeter film. And we would do this until the whole film was over. This would keep the room dark and all the youngsters interested in the motion picture, so we had very little problems of discipline. And of course, I had to have a special license as a 35 millimeter operator because this was nitrate film, and we had an impromptu steel-plated box built in the center of the auditorium, in which we still had to stand the platform on the seats in front of us in order to get a flat floor. And then I got a scholarship to the Graduate College of Education at Teachers College, Columbia University, under Paul Mort. Things were very tough. These were still days of the Depression. My teaching salary of $1,400 a year for teaching in the Canton public schools had been chopped to $700. So in 1935-36, I was drawing $700 a year. I rode the bus all the way to New York City, and when I got there, I immediately set up a series of jobs which paid most of my expenses. And finally, last one day, I was called into Mort's office, and Nick Engelhardt was there also. And another gentleman, whom I later discovered was Bernie Arnspiger. And Dr. Mort said, Mr. Brooker, he said, Dr. Arnspiger here has a new film company, ERPI Films, Electrical Research Products Incorporated. It's going to make educational pictures. And he was complaining about the fact that he couldn't get anybody who had a broad grasp of social studies. We ran through our cards. They weren't called computer, but there was another name, the Lasher cards. In those days, they ran them all through this machine and they fell in the slots.
Mm-hmm.
He said, we ran on, what?
A data processing type of
Well, it was the
system,
first one.
Punch card.
First
right.
one, it was a punch card. And he said, we found 3 at Teachers College this year that have taught every social studies that there is on the high school and the elementary level. You're one of the 3. And Arnspiger spoke up then, and he said, tell you what we want. We want a series of motion picture scripts on such principles as man and his environment, housing, way of living. Man and his environment is food. man and his environment and all of his other activities. And he said, as you know, that this is strictly social studies, and so we'd like to have you try to write a script on each of these subjects. Now, all you have to do in writing a script is to think in terms of pictures. If you start and talk it, you've made a mistake. Say it in pictures, but keep your mouth shut. And he said, of course, you know that there's two others, and for every script that we accept, we'll pay you $50. Well, in 1936, $50 was quite a bit of move. So I dashed back to my room in International House, and I wrote all three scripts that night. And the first thing the next morning, I grabbed all three scripts in my hot little hand, got the subway down to Columbus Circle where Irpy had their offices, and dashed upstairs and got it by the secretary to Dr. Arnspadger. And I said, here's the three scripts. He said, all ready? I said, yeah. Well, he said, you know, we'll have to wait at least 2 weeks to give these other two a chance because I made them the same proposition. I said, that's fair enough. Well, they never did come up with anything. And at the end of 2 weeks, Arnspadger called me up and he said, we're mailing you a check for $150. We've accepted all three scripts. Now, my wife had taken a job at $16.50 a week in order to allow me to go to Columbia University. But this $150 meant that I could take a trip home and be with my wife for Christmas and give her $50 on the side.
That's tremendous. Incidentally, I think we ought to mention that wasn't Irpy later bought by Encyclopedia Britannica?
This in itself, am I calling you the first name? Bob, is a story. You see, the first viable theatrical electrical application of sound was, the best one was by Westinghouse, you see. And no.
No, was this sound
Not
on any
Westinghouse.
film?
Sound on theatrical film. What's the other big, I hope you edit this.
You mean the one that Lee DeForest worked for?
Yeah.
General Electric?
No, it was another one.
RCA? Not Western Electric?
Western Electric.
Western Electric.
Was Western Electric. Well, they had trained in rapid sequence crews to bang it up and down the country and establish sound in every theater of the United States, because when sound came on, after Old Johnson's first singing, Mammy, boy, every theater had to have it.
Jolson.
Jolson. And then they had all these crews, and all of a sudden, all the theaters were wired. At this time, their best idea, they looked at the 7,000 high schools in the country. So they put on the highest pressure campaign you could ever imagine through the state boards of education, the city boards of education, to pay the cost of having the high schools wired for sound motion pictures. At this time, the federal government came in and broke up the Western Electric Trust.
And Bell Telephone. They were
Yes.
tied together.
Well, they didn't separate Western Electric from Bell Telephone, but they made Western Electric divest itself of motion picture production,
Oh.
and that became Audio Productions.
Mm-hmm.
Another branch was called Electrical Research Products Incorporated. Electrical Research, and this is where we got the name Irpy, you see. And the third branch had to do with equipment. Well, at this time, Irpy was so new that they had no films whatsoever. In that first year, they were able to get from Gaumont British and the Rankin interests in England the rights to a series of films called Life and Science and Nature series. They were outstanding films for those days, of the life cycle of the butterfly, for example. and of the turtle, etc. After that, I became well acquainted with a social science prof on the campus by the name of Carl Bigelow. Now, Carl Bigelow was active on many fronts. He was active with Mark May, social studies.
Mm-hmm. Mark May, who later did so much research on film and television.
Well, he was a dean at Yale University.
Mm-hmm.
And he had had a heavy hand in the production of the Yale University Chronicles.
Oh, the Chronicles of America series?
Yes, that's where he first became interested in films. And of course, he was also very close to the first czar of the motion picture industry.
You mean Will Hayes?
Yes. And he was helping Will Hayes fight the onslaught of the public, the Legion of Decency, the PTA, etc., who were astounded at the depravity shown by the theatrical films and didn't want their children having anything to do with it. They wanted to clean it up.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, you know, the whole appointment of Hayes was a cleanup job.
Right.
And Mark May had been in on that. Well, this is when Mark May got the notion of teaching film custodians, or what later became teaching film custodians.
That's amazing. I didn't realize that Mark May had anything to do with it.
Well, there was another meeting about this time in which I sat in with George Zook and Carl Bigelow of the Warner Brothers, the head of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, the elderly gentleman at that time who was the head of MGM, and of Pathé Studios. And this was this is where the question was first broached. Would they release their theatrical films for use by education? Perhaps in some cases with some editing. And, that argument went on all day because they could just simply see the profits from their box offices falling to zero.
Mm-hmm.
We on the educational side couldn't see anything at all because we did not see that there is any theatrical length films. It would be primarily their shorts. And so far as we were concerned, it could be their shorts after they had played in the theaters for 5 years when their life was dead anyway, you see. Warner was the one who broke the ranks and said, okay, because he was particularly and personally interested in historical series. And this was shortly after, well, that's another story. Darryl Zanuck made his fame on the film Woodrow Wilson. Mm-hmm. And that was simply done as a patriotic move.
Well, then, when was Teaching Film Custodians organized?
Well, in the summer of 1936, Carl Bigelow was named chairman of the Social Studies Committee, and I was named vice chairman.
Well, I noticed that you were vice chairman of the Social Studies panel.
That's right.
At that time, that was just called the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors Association.
That's right. These were the ones that are doing it, you see. And Hayes explained the whole thing to us. There were 5 people on the panel of which I served as chairman. And we saw 17 motion pictures every day that summer. And all
Features or shorts?
Shorts.
Shorts.
At the end of that summer, the panel of which I was chairman had seen 1,773 motion picture shorts. And I must say that after you have seen 28 Fitzpatrick travelogues, and so we say farewell in the fading sunlight to the fair, fair land of Australia and the beaches where the gods still play. It became just a trifle tiresome. And also the Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer series, Crime Does Not Pay. We saw 32 of those. Mm-hmm. And we wrote up criticisms of them. We made a final report, a very detailed report, in which we recommended a list of films that could be used as is. Another group of films that would need some slight modification that would require no new shooting, and a third group of films which could not be used at all. Now, it is from this first group of films that the first teaching film custodian catalog was compiled. Of course, don't forget now, there was another panel in science, there was another panel in the arts, and there was another health panel. There were 4 panels.
And they were all picking films from
They were seeing their own groups
commercial
of films,
producers.
you see. We would see none of the African safari pictures because those were all shown to the health side. I don't know why, but
That's interesting. Rather
think
than
it was-
social studies.
it was an arbitrary division. Social studies had too much already.
Well, when did the idea originate of cutting down features as part of the TFC
Well,
procedure?
this wasn't TSC. The progressive education was coming along at this time, and Alice Kelleher got the idea of taking theatrical features and using excerpts in classroom as a basis for discussion to begin to get at the emotional problems of children. You may recall the film Alice Adams. You will recall that this is a story of a beautiful young girl whose father is a mill worker, and this beautiful young girl falls in love with, and in turn, the boy is attracted to her, is from the aristocracy, one of the wealthy families. The girl brings, her boyfriend wants to come in and meet her parents, which, according to the film, was an indication that he was serious. She comes in, and her father has his galluses hanging down at the side of his pants. He's in his undershirt. He's preparing. He has his shoes and his socks off and his feet up, and he's drinking some beer. Alice, of course, is completely overwhelmed with embarrassment and shame with her father's attire, with his voice, with the words that he said. "What you doing here?" And at this time of day, she says goodbye to the boy and flees upstairs crying. Now, Dr. Kelleher had similar excerpts from such films as Black Fury and other films of that caliber made theatrically at that time. This was tried by Progressive Education, and she had the right to sell the prints. I happen to know that Indiana was offered a set of these prints, but didn't buy them.
I mean, Indiana University.
Yes. It turns out that Dr. Kelleher had a young man whom she had trained by the name of Mitchell. These were the only 2 individuals who you could use these films successfully in a classroom. And they, frankly, I sat in on 3 or 4 cases where they did. It was fantastically successful, the way she would get the teacher and the students. What would you do if you went home and found your father like this? Do you think you ought to ever go home and surprise your father? Do you think it's a mark of shame that you should be ashamed if you found your father attired like this? And how many of you have fathers who would be attired like this when you came home? But in one instance at least, when the teacher saw this picture, which she was showing to her class, she burst into tears and left the room and didn't even turn off the projector. And that happened in a dozen school systems. So the whole accepting of theatrical films and the emotional objectives, to my knowledge, just was a project that I thought was thoroughly worthwhile, but really failed because, well, call it whatever you please, the inability of the teachers to handle the emotional problems, the inability to have enough trained people to handle this kind of a discussion.
I think that's a very important point, that people were not used to using material this way.
Well, I don't think,
A lot of them still aren't.
as a matter of actual fact, that they were accustomed to discussing such personal things as emotions. A few years later, I was out at Mills College and at a summer workshop for the progressive education and for the American Council on Education. And I got the film, The Plow That Broke the Plains. And I showed the film. And 3 of my students got up from the room and left in tears because they were Okies that had just come to California and had gotten a job in the California schools. But they were crying, and they said they never wanted to see that film again because it was too heart-rending. It reminded them of so much.
Well, much of the material that teachers dealt with at that time, and much of the material that we still have, although it has changed considerably, was relatively neutral. Very bland. Textbooks, for example, were not emotionally involving.
Not only was it neutral, but it really were hardly motion pictures. I mean, let me illustrate that. You see, it was common in those days for what we called camera bums to wander over the world at random and travel where they pleased and to shoot a lot of film, and when they get back to the United States, offer it to the theatrical companies. They paid the most cash for it. And then as a last resort, offer it to the educational film companies that were beginning to come into being. And one of these camera bums, for example, was Amos Berg. And he shot 50,000 feet of film on the canals of England. And George Griffiths and I, both of whom had been on the teaching film custodian social studies panel, were invited by Barney Arnspadger up to view this 50,000 feet and turn it into a motion picture. Well, you learn very quickly that these cameramen shot themselves. I don't mean that figuratively in terms of committing suicide, but here was Berg, who was a very, very intelligent man and an intensely interesting man to hold a conversation with. Went to England, rode on these canals all up and down the entire length and breadth of England, and he had literally thousands of feet of film of women steering boats, of swans swimming in the canal, of boys and girls nude swimming in the canal. But he did not have a single foot of anything ever being loaded onto the barge or being unloaded. And of course, you couldn't make a film on the canals of England for an educational institution without having some part of what do those barges do and what were they used for, you see.
Right. Were there any locks in the canals? And did he have
no,
footage?
He didn't have any picture of the boats going through canal or through locks.
Locks. Mm-hmm.
As a matter of actual fact, Griffiths and I were both astounded once, and Berg was sitting here when we were doing this. The screen suddenly went black, and we thought that something had gone wrong, that the carbon arcs had burnt out. The carbon sticks, that made the old arc light, had burnt out, and no, that was going okay. And he said, "Don't worry now, just watch. And sure enough, way down at the end of that thing, a little speck of light began to appear. And it took it 10 minutes to get up to us. But he had shot a film, cranked the film, hand cranked it all the way through a tunnel. Well, eventually, we had to send a crew back to England, or ERPI did, to shoot some footage, to produce a film that was then turned into Canals of England. But the real point of this story is that it was customary at that time for a person to go to Japan, for example, and they would shoot a scene up around Kyoto, the beautiful temples up there. Now, don't forget that this later appeared in the motion picture as a single shot and became religion. And then they'd shoot a shot of a bunch of women in a factory making silk. Now, this later became industry. Then they would shoot a bunch of some footage of film of fisheries. And then they would shoot a shot in some kabuki play. And then it would wind up that here is a film dealing with the religion, the commerce, the industrial activities, the social and cultural life of Japan. Now, you'd have only one scene of each one, but that was what the
Right.
title would say.
Right.
Now, this made it a film, and they would also make it clear it could be used by kindergarten straight through high school. And this sold more prints. And so that was the story of that era of films. And, of course, there is some amusing episodes in this. John Bray got a chance to buy up a bunch of film footage of a famous ornithologist who had shot literally thousands of color film with a Kodak Cine of birds. But in his off time, he had been monkeying around with playing with chipmunks in the same grove of trees where he saw his birds. And he had tried a stunt of running a string from this tree to that tree and then putting some peanuts in a paper bag and tying it to a nut to the string and watching the chipmunks. Down below it, they would reach up and try to reach it and jump, and they couldn't make it. And then they would try to get across the string, and some would fall off. But finally, at last, one made it and got to the sack, hung on, ripped the sack open with his teeth, and got the peanuts. Well, Bray got Rita Hochheimer and her sidekick, Esther Berg, to make a film, to edit out a film and write the commentary. And he thought he really had a good film. So they wrote an advertising brochure. It so happened that I knew John Bray very well. He was incidentally the inventor and the originator of animated films. Disney was one of his students. But
And this is from the old Bray films.
that's right.
Yeah.
The old man was still living. But he showed me with great pride the 50,000 brochures that they had printed to advertise this film to the schools. And the title they had printed on it was How to Have Fun with Chippies.
Well,
And-
that
Yeah.
reference may be a little bit obscure for today's youth, but
It
we
wasn't
know what
then.
it means, yes.
And I told Bray that he'd simply have to burn up the 50,000. I said, look, if you put those brochures out to your school mailing, you'll set back the field of visual education 10 years. Because this will prove to everybody that we're just as dirty as the theatrical films.
Well, did that experience with the motion picture producers and the TFC people also contribute to your getting connected with the American Council on Education Studies?
Well, here I've got to go back a little bit. After the teaching film custodians, I became a regular scriptwriter for EBF, ERPI films.
Mm-hmm.
And I wrote scripts for the films on the Watusi, the Pygmies, the Mambettu, and at this time we were working with the cameraman Attilio Gatti, who was a very vivid character all of himself. And then there came the Film Council of America, not the Film Council of America, the Motion Picture Project. Zook had just recently left the commissionership of the U.S. Office of Education and became the president and director of the American Council on Education. Now, prior to this time, the American Council it had been a voluntary association that frankly hadn't amounted to much, and certainly it had no programs. The General Education Board, and I don't know whether this should be on the thing or not, had made a deal with Zook that if he really would make the ACE, American Council on Education, a force in the field of higher education, that they would help him out with grants. Well, Zook at this time, and there followed the Motion Picture Project, there followed the Teacher Education Commission, there followed the American Youth Commission, and a whole series of high-level commissions that were re-evaluating and reassessing the role of higher education in all its different aspects. Hoban was selected as the director.
It's Charles F. Hoban Jr.
Charles F. Hoban Jr. His father at that time was audiovisual director in Philadelphia, Charles F. Hoban Sr. Dr. Charles F. Hoban had just gotten his degree, and he was now the representative of Sound Pictures. Now, another part of this, both of us, I, not Charlie, attended our first audio-visual meeting of DVI.
That's DVI, Department of Visual Instruction,
Yes.
of NEA.
In 1938. At that time, there were 28 people present in the Carter Hotel in Cleveland.
Now, at that time, DVI met with AASA, didn't it, the American Association of School Administrators?
Not always.
Not always?
They did for the fall meeting, but the summer meeting, they held it south.
Oh.
You see. And 28 people were present at the national meeting of DVI in the summer of 1938. Again, Dr. Bigelow had close contacts with Floyd Reeves, who at that time was working with Dr. Zook, and with Marsh, who was a vice president of the American Council. So Hoban was led to Brooker, and the two liked each other, and I was hired as associate director in charge of field research and field studies. But before I go on with the story of the American Council on Education, there are some things that I think I should go back and pick up that I think are of historical importance. One of the great fears of the public at that time was that the children seeing the motion pictures in a dark room would injure their eyes. Now, Eastman Kodak had made a bunch of silent pictures, and incidentally, Arthur Fleming, who later became the director of Federal Security Agency, at that time was a vice president of Eastman, and he was the one who supported their starting the production of motion pictures. They had tinted all their films a deep amber color in order to prevent any injury to the eyes. And all the people on the panels that were seeing the teaching film custodian films had their eyes examined by a battery of ophthalmologists every week to make sure that their eyes were not being damaged by seeing so many motion pictures. And this was used throughout the educational journals of the time to give proof to the fact that seeing the motion pictures was not injurious to the eyes of children. Now, another point was that I would say offhand, some $30 to $40 million had been lost in the field of educational motion pictures. First of all, you had Western Electric belief that the high schools of the country constituted a fantastic market for putting up sound systems, and some dozen or so did. And Western Electric spent much more on an advertising campaign on this. One German company put together 15,000 projectors, which had sound that was played on a disc. And the motion picture was geared in with this disc.
Well, that was very similar to the Vitaphone process,
yes,
wasn't it?
And, of course, these wound up over in a warehouse in Hoboken, and when World War II came along and there was a tremendous shortage, everybody was telling me about these 15,000 projectors over in Hoboken, and I finally at last went over and saw them. And they were very ingenious gadgets, but this time we had sound on film, and they were completely out of date. Now, money was lost in many ways. Back in 1923 or 26, Edison himself had written in McClure's journal that educational films would make the teacher obsolete.
Mm-hmm.
This had frightened a lot of teachers, and so in general the teachers were negative to using films in classroom. The educational pictures started out as a big moneyed concern, sparked by McCormick of Chicago, to make educational films. They made 3. One was one of the most fantastic films I personally have ever seen, which definitely gave you a motion picture of what a desert mirage was, and then scientifically explained how the mirage was created. Another was on the geographic forms of what an isthmus, a bay, a peninsula, and so forth. Another one was on cloud formations and weather forecasting. They failed to sell, however, and so they went into theatrical production, and of course they became the slapstick comedies. And I suppose that the original capital was returned in all the slapstick comedy that they sold. It was later became Educational Pictures, the spice of the program. And they went on for years. Now, about this time, too, the Yale Chronicles had finally at last come out with their pictures. These were perhaps the most authoritative, well-researched pictures ever made. Everything from the buttons on the coats of the soldiers, to the exact length of the muskets, to the exact dimensions of the hats, had been fought over and argued about by some of the foremost historians of the United States. And the Yale Chronicles brought them out just a year after sound 16-millimeter film came into being. Theirs were all 16 frames a second. All the motion pictures now were 24 frames a second. And so it was a deadly flop. And I think that that venture alone, even in terms of 1935 and 36, cost Yale University in the neighborhood of $5 million.
Although, wasn't it true that many educators were reluctant to accept sound on an educational film? I remember Leila Trollinger, for example, at the University of Colorado, did not even buy a sound print until late into the 30s, if I'm not mistaken. Had a tremendous collection of silent films because they felt that the sound should be added by the teacher as
Yes.
the film was shown.
And so did Boyd Rakestraw at California. You see, their theory was that a silent picture, well, let us say a beautiful picture of a lake and a forest, could be used as a story in geography. It could also be used as a theme for an essay. Well, the very minute you put a scientific discussion on the soundtrack, you ruled out ever using this picture as a basis for an essay, you see. And that was quite a school of thought, and incidentally, the school, I think, is still valid. You're finding today a lot of people argue that radio stimulated more imagination than does television.
Right. And, of course, we're also seeing a renaissance in the narrationless film.
That's right. And to a certain extent, the people who believe in the vividness of the imagination with the lessened stimulation that comes from sound as opposed to pictures, it's been bypassed, but it hasn't been dead, and in my judgment has not yet been fully answered. And of course, the same argument extends over into another period. To what extent, by showing pictures of Christ, do we tend to rob the mystic approach of the Christians of the world in showing exactly what Christ looked like? For example, during these years, I spoke at Green Bay in Wisconsin, which was a religious summer meeting place. And did you hear the story I told upstairs?
Yes.
Is that fit to repeat here?
Oh, I think so.
And I'll never forget that we were standing, some of us speakers, up on the entranceway and down below. Two motion picture producers were talking. And we heard one voice say, "My Jesus Christ is a better Christ than yours." And the other producer said, "How do you make that out?" He said, "Well, when you remember where Mary Magdalene washes his feet, your Christ has bunions." "Oh, I know, it shows makeup on it. It looks like it's all been powdered over, but anybody who knows feet knows it is a bunion." And furthermore, it has ingrowing toenails. And the other fellow said, well, I never noticed that. Well, he said, you better go and look at it another time. And finally, my Christ is under contract. He's never played any role but Christ, and he never will play any other role but Christ because I've got an ironclad contract with him. Now, this cost me a whale of a lot of cash to get him to lay off any other actor's roles. Your Christ has played heavy in several recent films, and he may do so again. And then what are you going to do? Well, other than the humor of the situation, the question remains is what would happen if a child saw a man playing the role of Christ in one film and a thug in a theatrical film?
Well, according to legend, that problem did dog H.B. Warner, didn't it? He played Christ in Cecil B. DeMille's original King of Kings production, and he had difficulties getting roles after that because people just couldn't see putting Christ in another part.
That's right. And that's happened with every religious film. I am surprised that Heston overcame it in the Ten Commandments, you see.
Mm-hmm. Well,
but I think all of these have a role. Now let's come back to the American Council on Education. The project was organized as a motion picture project. We had a prestigious advisory board on which there sat such people as Mark May, Dr. W. W. Charters, one of the great men and one of the great stimulators of the field. We set up a whole series of objectives. Did a film have a role in the classroom as opposed to a role in the auditorium? What did the teachers have to know in order to use a film effectively? What body of films existed that were educationally effective and available? What kinds of educational objectives could films serve? We also considered the organization of the program and raised such questions as who were the producers and the suppliers of equipment. And incidentally, let me note here that there was an awful lot of argument at the time about sound and silent films, about film strips as opposed to film slides, about motion pictures as opposed to slides. And in part, this argument derived from the fact that we had a whole series of highly honest and highly courageous industrial companies producing materials, producing equipment. But the person that produced silent equipment did not produce sound equipment. And the person producing sound equipment did not produce silent equipment. We did not have a single doubling up of the production of sound or silent motion picture projectors, nor of film slides, or of film strips, or of motion pictures, or of opaque material, or of stethoscope material, or of stereoptic material. And so obviously when they got together, the Society for Visual Education, SVE, was fighting tooth and toenail for the film strip and the slide. The old gentleman Spencer, not Spencer, he was a Nobel Prize, not a Nobel, but he was a Rhodes Scholar. Anyway, he was one of the grand gentlemen of the commercial exhibits. He was fighting his life for stereopticon views, and they had something like 40,000 stereopticon slides that they'd sent cameramen all over the world. Also of the forerunner of the overhead projector, which was the stethoscope to teach speed reading. Now, this led to a lot of controversy, which was quite unnecessary, and which, when one company began to produce both the motion picture, Bell and Howell, and the film strip projector and the slide projector, the argument began to die down, because then more people had a chance to see what each was good for. Some difficulties and shortcomings we would use only the films that were available. There were, for example, no films whatsoever available in the area of physical skills. There were few films available for the K3 level, kindergarten, first, second, and third grade. There were more films in geography than there were in science, and more in science than there were in literature. We would be limited by the flexibility of the teachers who volunteered and no teacher was used if she was definitely opposed to the idea. And some of the questions, side questions that we considered was, can students make motion pictures, and can it be an educational process? Another one, if you see Hamlet performed in a motion picture, do you need to read the play? Another one, does one take the place, or can it be considered as being educationally equal to the other? We organized, first of all, what we called a trial program. And this was up at Tower Hill School in Wilmington, Delaware. Mrs. Sharp was the principal there, and we used that as a break-in program to stabilize how do you order films, how do you get teachers to preview films, how do you get teachers to evaluate films, how do you break teachers in and train students in the operation of the projectors, and so forth and so on. This was really a trial program in every aspect of the application, because the Wilmington school had no trouble with monies. You know why.
The DuPonts.
The Tower Hill School was a privately supported school. And that's one of the reasons we selected. But in every way, we used it as a pioneer for all the rest of the program. And of course, we were able to do some things there that later we couldn't do. A lot of informal studies that were made. For example, we took one of the Gaumont British Nature and Science series, and we ran it on every grade, from the seniors in high school down to the third grade. Now, this is not statistically sound research. This is very informal. But we found that in the opinion of the teachers, the children on the third grade could get 80% or better of all the concepts in the picture. What they couldn't get were the scientific names, larvae, pupae, and so forth. But they got 80% of all the meat of the film, and they understood the life cycle of the butterfly as well as the seniors in high school did. But the seniors in high school, of course, could use all the technical terminology, and furthermore than that, they could write about it and spell it correctly. Now, another thing we found, that if we showed a silent motion picture on, let us say, autumn, and had the students write an essay on it, the teachers claimed that they used more creative expression and a wider range of vocabulary than they did when they were given a verbal assignment. Like write a essay on a trip to the autumn woods, for example. And
very interesting. To go back to the point you made before about the third grade students getting about 80% of the concepts. That was similar results were obtained in the Pain Fund studies, as I recall, when the children that they used as subjects there got up to about 66 to 70% of the information that the adults did in watching a feature film. Now, let me ask you an interesting question in regard to that. Wouldn't those results tend to support the practice used by educational materials producers of recommending their films from everywhere from primary to senior high school?
No. In my judgment, it would not support it. And it's for these reasons. The films, in a sense, of those days were crude. And by that I mean this. Whenever you change the objective which a film is to serve, you change the cutting, you change the editing, you change the emphases, you change the camera angles. You even change the kinds of lenses you use. With a sophisticated film, one that was made to stimulate the imagination and to serve as a basis for essays, could possibly be used in geography in the first grade. And I think probably quite well, and I think the criticisms I'm making would be technical and would have no appreciable effect on the effectiveness of the film. In other areas, I think that it would be very, very much different. And I honestly doubt if there's any film that can be used on all 8 grades with equal success, unless perhaps it is on some general, very general subject, such as be kind to animals, take care of your pets.
Mm-hmm.
But on the specific objectives of education, and of course, be kind to animals is certainly one of those specific objectives, I doubt very much. I know that the film producers would like to have you believe that most films can be used on a wide range of grades, but I think we're moving away from that. Just as we cannot possibly use the same textbook on the 3rd grade as we would on the 5th or 6th grade, likewise,
Yes.
I do not think that we can use the same film.
Well, I happen to concur because when I was directing the audiovisual program in Colorado Springs, we put out our catalogs according to grade levels and pinpointed the films for those grade levels. But to get back to the American Council on Education, didn't you were a co-author with Harrington of Denver, weren't you, on the
Yes.
one about the school-made motion pictures?
That's right.
In which, if it was Denver, wasn't it?
Right.
Where the children in high school there, or students in high school, made their own motion pictures.
Right.
That movement seem to have not really gathered momentum until relatively recently when 8mm was introduced.
Yes. And I think costs had a lot to do with it. Of course, I think another thing was the teachers of those times. How many people think in pictorial terms?
Mm-hmm.
How many people understand the subtleties? Let us say that I show you a beautiful young maiden chewing an ear of corn, and then I cut to a hog with an ear of corn in his mouth. Or instead of cutting that way, let us say I cut to a deer browsing in a forest glade. Now, if I go from the girl to the hog, I have completely changed your picture of the girl. You see?
Mm-hmm.
I have not improved the picture of the hog, but I have demeaned and denigrated the picture of the girl.
Yes.
On the other hand, if I go from the girl to the deer, I have reinforced the emotional impact of the girl eating corn. The subtleties of motion picture have to be learned rather painfully,
Right.
and very few teachers understand this.
Incidentally, just as a commentary on that, Floyd, there has been some research on the juxtaposition of images in film. And in the spring 1975 issue of ABCR, there's an article by a man named Eisenhower who reviews that research. I just wanted to get that little note in there.
I am very glad to know that. And I must confess that I have not read all the research that's been done in the field in all these years.
Well, now let me go back to one other point about the American Council. Didn't the American Council also put out some of their own materials? It seems to me that when I was in Colorado Springs in 1949, we acquired some film strips, and I'm sure were they either produced by American Council or inspired or approved by them?
They, on a very informal basis, some young producers that were just starting out said, "Would you give us some leadership?"
Oh, that was it.
And we said yes. But in no way were they approved by the American Council. They were not paid for by the American Council. And it was purely informal, and no names were ever used, and they have no right, they never had any right to use the name of the American Council.
Okay. What do you see as the major impact of the American Council on Education Studies on the development of the field?
Well, when Dr. Hoban and I started out in the motion picture project, we approached one of the prominent universities of the country in order to get the cooperation and assistance of their College of Education. The dean of that College of Education looked us square in the face and said, if a single professor on my faculty ever uses a motion picture in the class, he will be fired the very minute I discover it, because I will know that he's utterly incompetent. Nobody needs a motion picture in the room if he's a good teacher, you see.
Right.
And this was told to us by a dean of one of the biggest and most prominent schools of education in the country. And plenty of school superintendents would have supported it.
Well, that legacy lingers. I know that, again, in my tenure at Colorado Springs, I had more than one principal want to get from me information on how many films certain teachers used, because they had a suspicion that those people weren't teaching. They were just showing films.
Well, we made several studies on that. We found that in every case it was the younger teachers that were using the most films, and the oldest teachers that were most dead set against it, you see. Mm-hmm. And, of course, there's an awful lot that had to be worked out. I mean, for example, we had plenty of stories of films being delivered to a building and being lost. Nobody ever knew that they arrived. Nobody ever knew what happened to them. And finally, at last, we started the practice of having every building appoint a building coordinator. And this was simply to keep track of the films and have somebody who was definitely assigned to picking it up and being responsible. Mm-hmm. We have found films up in the clothes rack in the principal's office. He simply got it and forgot about it, didn't know what it was anyway, and he just wanted to make sure it was safe, so he put it in his office. But then he never told anyone about it. A lot of this happened, and of course, many other things happened. I'll never forget up in Wisconsin at Eau de Claire. The teacher was very proud of the fact that she was using films, and obviously with my being there, she was going to demonstrate. And so she showed a film on a screen with all the windows open on a bright sunshiny day, and with a shutter that was constantly sticking and causing the picture to flicker, and with a hole right in the center of the scene, a triangular hole, at least 9 inches on each side.
In the screen?
Yes. And we said to her, look, I said, how can you show a picture like this? Oh, she said, the kids get used to it.
Well, but let me go back to the American Council. If we left it where you did there with the dean of that prominent school of education.
Well, that isn't fair.
Right, and surely that was an isolated example, I would hope.
The Stanford University were gung-ho, and the entire faculty of Stanford University wanted in on the experiment that we were conducting at Santa Barbara. It so happened that Stanford University at that time was doing some work with Santa Barbara schools.
Was Francis Noel in Santa Barbara at that time?
Francis Noel was an industrial arts teacher.
Mm-hmm.
And he is the one, on his own initiative, that came to Washington and persuaded Hoban that Santa Barbara was the ideal place for him to put a study on the West Coast. And I'm sure that the trip he paid for out of his own pocket. But that's the initiative of Francis
Knowing
Noel.
Francis, I'm sure he did pay it out of his own pocket.
Yes. And, who was the superintendent of schools? He later became one of our most ardent supporters. And the superintendent of schools at St. Louis, if we wanted to put a superintendent on the platform at the Florida Education Annual Meeting Institute or up in the main place, these were the two superintendents we'd go and we'd recommend them as speakers. And they did a great job. Of course, the first time that Charlie Hoban and I went to Santa Barbara to see the superintendent, he said, boys, I'd like to take you for a drive. And we said, okay. The country around Santa Barbara is simply gorgeous. Mm-hmm. And we went to a little community and went into a bar and had some drinks. And he said, I think I ought to explain to you that my contract says that I will not take a alcoholic beverage within 20 miles of the city limits of Santa Barbara. And the contracts for the teachers in those days in California defined how far the neck could be shown. The collarbone had to be covered by at least 1 inch, and it must extend at least 12 inches below the knee.
Mm-hmm.
Not only that, but the girls had to sign a contract that they would teach Sunday school if they were asked. And you may be assured that all of them were asked. Furthermore, that they would not smoke, use foul language, nor drink a alcoholic beverage within 20 miles of the city limits.
Outside of 20 miles, all hell could break loose. But,
Well, the kids wouldn't see it.
Yeah. Well.
And, of course, our studies at University of Minnesota were utterly fascinating. They, in a sense, were a failure because when the lights went out, the students engaged in other activities than paying any attention to the motion picture or the teacher. They were more interested in each other as human beings. And that's one of the reasons that one of the leaders in the field never got his doctorate.
Ole? Is that right?
That's right.
I was going to ask you if Ole Larson was at Minnesota during that time.
Yes, he was. And, of course, look, each one of these is a whole story.
Right, right.
At Minnesota, who was the name of the fellow who got the original grant to produce a film up there? Bob Kissick.
Ah.
Bob Kissick. Bob Kissick had set up one of the earliest audiovisual units on a college campus. And he had trouble getting money, so he simply charged everybody $5 every time they used a film in the class. And it came out of their budgets, each respective teacher. Bob Kissick got $50,000 from the General Education Board and made a film called The Minnesota Document. And it had one of the most magnificent and beautifully shot scenes I have ever seen in a motion picture of a rat picking up scraps off a kitchen floor and going back into its hole. But he insisted upon using commercial music on the soundtrack, to which he had never received a release,
right.
and which later he couldn't get a release. So here is one of the most magnificent documentaries ever made in the United States that I do not believe has had an audience of more than 100 people.
That's a shame. That's happened more than once. And, of course, in those days, you used to blend the track and the narration. In other words, today, the narration and the music would have been on separate tracks, and you could just eliminate the music. Right. I would be very much interested at this point in your assessment of the impact of the American Council on Education Studies on the development of the audiovisual field.
I think that perhaps the primary thing that could be said on that point would be that, first of all, the Motion Picture Project of the American Council on Education established the academic integrity and respectability of films in the classroom as educational tools.
What were the major publications?
Well, there were a whole series of them, and I'm sorry I haven't had more time. But one was on motion pictures in education, written by Dr. Hoban. Another one was on Students Make Motion Pictures.
That's the one that you did with Harrington.
That's right, in Denver. Another one was on a list of 500 films with film descriptions. There were two others. And Santa Barbara brought out one. Now, the one that was supposed to come from the General College never arrived. Tower Hill School got out a booklet, too, on their experiences. And there was one on utilization. It was supposed to have been written, but the funds ran out before it got into print, and so it was just dropped.
Seems to me that you mentioned one product of the studies that didn't get the attention that it really deserved, and that was the one on how catalog descriptions of films should be written.
Yes, we wrote a booklet pointing out the essentials for writing an effective film description for use in a distribution or sales catalog. And just to quote from memory, one of them was that the difficulty of the subject matter should be reflected in the title. In other words, if the title was making a reaming cut, interrupted cut, on a turret lathe on a 36-inch head, if you didn't understand the title, we did not want you to have the film because you would never understand the film. Because this particular film is on how to operate a bullied vertical turret lathe in the cutting of a 6/1000-inch cut, of a reaming cut, on a nose cone made out of magnesium for the Flying Fortress bomber engines. And it was a key piece of material for the war effort. And this was true also of all the other films. Another rule was that the film might have 2 or 3 various phases or subjects covered. The wording in the film write-up should roughly or quite accurately reflect. If you use 10 words for something and you had a 50-word write-up, then those 10 words ought to indicate only a fifth of the content of the motion picture.
Mm-hmm.
If you saw something you liked, you went hog wild and wrote the whole 40 words or 50 words on that 1/5 of the film, you certainly would give it a mistaken impression. Of course, there were plenty of people that were only too glad to give you a mistaken impression.
Yes. Well, then, to get back to my original question, you really saw the impact of the ACE studies on legitimizing the audiovisual field for formal education.
Well, not only that, but you see all the committees that were involved. Dr. Zook was a genius. We had our motion picture project committee, and everything we did had to be approved by the Board of Trustees of the American Council on Education. Well, when you got the caliber of people we had, at that time, the president of Chicago University, the head of Cornell University, and people of that caliber all across the nation. One of the top officials, well, the president of California, University of California, was on the board. Well, when you get people like this on a board who fight and argue and hear the pleas for the budget and the scheduled programs and so forth, and they finally approve it, this constitutes a form of education. And furthermore, plenty of schools were quite happy to have the prestige of the American Council on Education having selected their school system, and those superintendents were all in support. This marked the wave of acceptance and respectability throughout the nation. Now, there were a few spots, of course, where local officials still didn't approve of films and regarded them as a fad and a frill, and so said so. And this was a period, too, when we were leading the fight, practically all over the country, for a minimum of 10 cents per year per student. And the first place that we met that mark was in a school system in Connecticut.
Do you remember which one it was?
It's a place where George Ingham is.
Oh, in Bridgeport.
Bridgeport. That's where it was. 10 cents. He isn't in Bridgeport proper, is he?
Well, he's at the University of Bridgeport.
No, before.
Before that.
Yes.
Oh my!
But you remember the school system? If you have all the old directories of AECT or DVI,
Oh, I'm sure we'll find it out.
you'll be able to
Yes.
run it down. But you remember George Ingham.
Oh yes, he's at the University of Bridgeport.
It
Right.
was his school system that first came through with the 10 cents per student per year. This was the first instance where in a given school system we had a budget we could definitely figure on.
It's interesting.
And, well, I don't think that's wholly true. I'm sure that Libby Golderman out at
In St. Louis.
St. Louis had a set budget. I'm sure that Margaret DeVizia in
Los Angeles.
had, and the girl down at San Diego, Marion Evans, had. But in general, this was true that whatever budgets Well, those schools didn't advertise their budgets. This
Right.
is the first budget we could advertise.
Well, from my own experience, there was a long period of time, even after that, where audiovisual departments did not have their own budgets, but simply requested funds as they went along.
Or they begged the PTA to raise money for them.
Oh, well, that I think we still have with us.
Yeah.
Well,
And another final thing which I don't want to overlook, and which none of us anticipated, was the motion picture project, the American Council on Education, became unwittingly a primary tool for the training of personnel for the tremendous advance of films in the war effort of the United States government.
well, that's a subject we want to get into next.
Yes, okay, sir.
Okay, when did the American Council on Education Studies phase out?
I would say within 30 days, this way or the other, January, February 1940. You see.
So it wasn't too long after that that the war effort then started.
I think Dr. Charles F. Hoban, Jr. might well have continued on until May in order to wind up the publications, close out the furniture, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Now, in discussing the tremendous war effort in production of films, what was the start of that? How did it get going, and how were the key people selected?
Well, of course, the Navy had made the first training film ever made when they made the film in World War I for the use of the Y gun, which is a submarine, anti-submarine device, for the throwing of what they called the ash cans off the rear end of ships.
The depth charges.
Yes. You may remember that the Y gun shot two simultaneously.
Right.
Far enough away from the ship so if they did explode when they went in the water, they wouldn't hurt the ship. But when they sank, if they caught a submarine in between them, the submarine was done for. That was the first film that was made. Little was done between the two wars, as far as I know. Of course, Colonel Schlossberg in the Army had always fought for films, and he was up at the camp in New Jersey. And they were doing some experimental work, but nothing that was noticeable, and nothing that I was aware of. On the other hand, I wasn't particularly interested in Army films in those days, so it may have been doing a
Right.
lot.
This was Fort Dix?
Yes. And the Navy and the Air Force had practically nothing. The Marine Corps, nothing. The Coast Guard, nothing. The Army did have something going. The U.S. Office of Education hadn't even dreamed of it. And of course, how each one got started is a different story. The only story I can really tell you is the story of the U.S. Office of Education. And I'm adding this story this time to just give you an indication of how sometimes programs get started. I had taught school for a good many years. In addition to that, I had worked in a steel mill. And in addition to that, I had worked around a steel furnace. So I had some notion of machinery. And I noticed furthermore that when you wanted to train somebody how to play golf or swing a stick, the best way to do it was for the other person to imitate another person doing it. And one of the best illustrations, of course, is how to tie a bow tie on a tuxedo or a formal dress attire. And I've known people that could do it only by standing behind a person, reaching their arms over their shoulders and tying it blindfold, but they do a good job of tying it. So I became convinced that films could be used for physical skill training. On a long shot and through some close friends, I was able, early in 1940, to get an interview with Sidney Homan. Let's look abroad for a moment. The European war had heated up. The phony war days were gone. They ended in 1939 with the onslaught of Hitler against Poland for Lebensraum, living room, and the Stukas, of course, bombing Poland, and then coming across Belgium and Holland on the way to France. I'm dead certain that Roosevelt was sure that we were going to get into the war. So he organized a board called the OEM, the Office of Emergency Management. To head up this board, he selected Big Bill Knudsen, who had been a top engineer in Ford Motor Car Works before his retirement, and another man who was skilled in large organizational efforts, namely Sidney Hillman of the ILGUW, the International Ladies
Garment Workers Union.
Garment Workers Union.
Yeah. Well, he was also assistant to Phil Murray in the CIO, wasn't he?
That's right, when it was organized. Well, I finally at last did get an appointment for 3 o'clock on the afternoon on Friday. And it happened to be Friday, January the 11th, 1940. I remember that date because the next day was my wife's birthday. And I went up to see Hellman. He was a very sharp individual, very intelligent. He knew a lot about hand operations from the clothing industry. And he wanted to know why I thought that films could be used to teach skills. Not only that, but what was the importance if they could be? So what? Films were going to be expensive, weren't they? Well, yes and no. The individual film was certainly a lot more expensive than a textbook, but if you trained 200,000 people with it, it became a whale of a lot cheaper than 200,000 textbooks or 200,000 pamphlets. Every aspect, I would say, was thoroughly canvassed. All I could give him, of course, was my own personal experience, my background, my personal history, my beliefs. I had no proof. Up to that time, to my knowledge, no training film had ever been made and had been evaluated or studied or researched. Around 4:30, he called in Knudsen, and he asked pretty much the same questions. After a very intense discussion, they thanked me, particularly for thinking to come along and discuss the idea with them, and they said they'd let me know. Well, I had been told that plenty of times, and then, of course, they never called. So I went home, didn't think too much about it. The next morning, at 8 o'clock, I got a telephone call from John W. Studebaker, the Commissioner of Education. And he said, "Are you the Floyd Brooker that talked yesterday with Sidney Hillman and Knudsen?" I said, "Yes, why?" "Well," he said, "I'm at the office, and I want you to come down right away. I want to talk with you." Now, what I did not know, and what I learned later, is as soon as I had left the office, Hillman and Knudsen had got in touch with Floyd Rees. Dr. Floyd Rees was a leading authority in education. He was the liaison of Franklin Delano Roosevelt with OEM. He thought that the idea was a good one and carried it back to Roosevelt. President Roosevelt grabbed an old envelope and on the back of it wrote, "John, try this out. Take $50,000 that has thus far been allocated to the vocational fund, FDR. Put a date on it." That had been in John Studebaker's hands at 11 o'clock on Friday night.
That was fast.
Well, there was a feeling of intense preparation.
Even as early as 1940.
Oh, yes. We all knew it was coming. When we had the Declaration of the Four Freedoms in the North Atlantic, and I don't know whether you knew it or not, but half of the destroyers that escorted President Roosevelt's ship up there were loaned to the British to escort Winston Churchill's ship back to England, because the submarine war was getting more serious, and they only had 2 destroyers to guard his ship. So we loaned them 4 destroyers to guard their ship. And this, as I said, was intense, a period of intense. Well, a lot of people were dead certain that war was coming, and by golly, we had better hurry and get ready for it. And this had happened in the case of Studebaker.
Right.
As a matter of actual fact, my salary until the end of February at the Office of Education was paid for with personal checks from Studebaker because I was not officially on the government roll. The government would not admit that I was a professional person. They insisted upon classifying me as a CAF, which in those days meant clerical, administrative, and fiscal, you see. And they would not admit that being an audiovisual specialist was at all a professional job. In fact, they classified it among the administrative, under which they also classified the janitors, elevator operators, so forth and so on. Well, the Assistant Commissioner of Education, C.F. Kleinfelder, was assigned to the project. He was one of the grandest men that I ever met. He knew vocational guidance from A to Z. He had been a vocational guidance teacher for years. He was an expert on training fire crews and on the friction of water and water hose and how much water a 7-inch hose would deliver at 200 feet, at 300 feet, at 400 feet, and under what pressure. He knew all of those because he had trained thousands of fire departments all up and down the country. We sat a long time, and he did not know films, but we discussed it, and we came to several conclusions. One was that we would do it through commercial producers. We would not set up our own producing unit. Now, the reason for this is we could multiply our efforts because there are 30 or 40 well-known commercial producers in the United States, including Wilding, Jam Handy, Caravel Films, etc., etc., etc. The second, now this we recognize would constitute some difficulties. And one of the basic difficulties, and we recognized this from the very beginning, was that everybody at that time was trained for Hollywood.
Right.
Now, the difference Hollywood shooting and training film shooting is that when you stage a kiss, everybody on the whole set, from the people who handle the lights to the people who handle the sound recording lines to the people who handle the cameras, they know what a kiss is. They know all the components of it. They know exactly where to set up to get, and they know that there's what a boy looks like and what a girl looks like. So they know where to set up the camera. And you have the long shot, boy and girl looking at each other, and she slyly smiling. And close medium, they move together. Medium shot, they begin to embrace. Close up, lips meet together, and the kiss is consummated. They know exactly how long it's going to take, and the cameraman can tell you to an inch how much film he's going to shoot on it. But when you ask him to take a picture of a burr on a helical gear, he first of all has no notion what a helical gear is. He has no notion what a burr is. He has no idea what it looks like. He has less idea why we want a picture of it. And so you have to do an intense job of educating the entire camera crews. We were fortunate. As a matter of actual fact, the individual who shot many of our technical films at Lux and Norling was Jack Norling himself. He was an expert machinist. It is his hands that's holding the micrometer. When he's describing the micrometer, it was he who wrote the animation. And he was the one that was directing the camera where to be and telling him exactly what to do. He also did the one on the vernier scale. He also did practically all of our engineering film because he was an expert, top-notch mechanic. He knew all about it, and he took over the direction of a picture, although he had never directed a picture before. And this immediately posed the problem of what kind of a contract would we issue? You see, anything that we did in the area of buying materials or services with government funds had to be under the eagle eye of GSA, the General Services Administration, and their attorneys, and also have final approval of the Attorney General. How do you buy a motion picture when you don't know in advance what's going to be in it? After a certain amount of fumbling, we finally at last came up with one of the most unique contracts that I think was ever developed or ever used in government. This was a contract for 5 motion pictures, with the understanding that they would all be in one setting, with one actor, and only with voice over. Nothing else in the soundtrack, and no animation. Now, what would they charge us per foot for additional indigenous sound? Like we wanted to give the trainee the sound of the machine when it was truly operating and cutting. We also wanted to give him the sound of this machine when the cutting tool began to make a shriek, which was a sign of danger in which a smart operator will cut off the machine immediately, because it means that the bolts on the casting that he's cutting is being loosened. How much would they charge us for animation? And we devised 3 different levels of animation, A, B, and C. A was simple, repetitive animation. B would have as many as 2 moving parts and would not be repetitive. And C could be the very most technical kind of animation with 3 to 4 simultaneous moving parts in direct relationship to each other. How much would they charge us for an additional setting and additional location? How much would they charge us if they had to have 1, 2, or 3 additional people instead of just one, the operator? How much would they charge us or would they deduct if we provided the machine? It was a very technical contract, but nevertheless, it worked. Incidentally, I should say that it was written right into the contract that every film was on a job. We decided that we were going to do the film on jobs, such as they do in what we call a custom shop, and not a big production shop where they have automatic screw machines, automatic lathes, and everything else. These were the kind of shops that you found in schools, and they were the kind of shops which were doing the kind of work that most of the war workers were doing when they got a job in the big factories. Now, in addition to this had another implication of which we were not wholly aware of at the time. The tradition and the custom throughout the entire field of educational motion pictures was that each 16 millimeter film would be 360 or 400 feet. We decided right off the bat that we were never going to trim our subject matter to an arbitrary time limit. You will not find, even in retrospect, I believe, any 2 films produced by the U.S. Office of Education War Training Film Program, any 2 films that are exactly the same length. The films ranged, and I'm talking about 16 millimeter, from 2,700 feet to 280 feet. And in terms of the individual producers, we tried to balance this out in a point of mutual fairness. If he had a 2,700-foot film, we would sometimes count that as much as 3 motion pictures. And, of course, that wasn't exactly cricket either, because 3 times 4 is 12, and he'd put 2,700 feet, and he still was only getting the bill for 3 pictures.
Right.
But it worked.
And it was acceptable to them.
Yes. Because they were saving money. Imagine being able to set up just once and shoot 5 pictures.
Right.
And one right after the other, with the same operator, the same equipment, and the crews rolling right along. Now we also had to set up a regular schedule for supervision. I don't know now that I remember all of the steps, but the first step was, of course, a notification that he had been awarded a contract. The second was a notification of the subjects that he had been awarded. Now, the regular follow-up approvals after that was, first of all, the producer was bound not to proceed until we had approved the machine, the operator, the setting, the background, and every aspect of these things. What did the operator's voice sound like? What did the commentator's voice sound like? How did the machine sound? How did it look? Was the background cluttered? Was the background too far away? All of these were factors.
And these were all approved in advance?
They had to be.
It must have taken an awful lot of on-location traveling on the part of the staff.
It did. It did. Believe me. And, well, as just an anecdote, we were traveling all the time. And in Washington, in wartime, it was not easy to get reservations on Pullman cars nor on planes. And there were very few planes until halfway through the war. We were traveling trains all the time. But we picked out one operator at the Pennsylvania station in Washington, D.C. I never did know her name. None of us ever saw her, but she was number 17. One time she got us a reservation. And so the staff sent back to the general manager of the Washington Railroad Terminal highly commendatory letters on Girl 17. And we always sent a carbon copy to Girl 17. And they got these letters from people in Boston and people in Chicago and people in Detroit and people in Pittsburgh and all over the country. And they were all beautifully written on official government stationery and or the local producer stationery, because we couldn't give too many on the letterhead of USOE. So number 17 would always see to it that we got reservations all through the war. Now, out on the West Coast, in San Francisco, there was a girl that thought, oh, you're those audio-visual people helping the blind. Well. We never disabused her. She was a lovely, kindly old soul. And yes, we were trying to help people. And so she always see to it that we get reservations on Pullmans and trains and anything else wherever we wanted to go. Now our production was scattered between 37 motion picture producers. At one time, we had 337 motion pictures in production.
That's an incredible number.
We had decided, furthermore, that a motion picture wasn't enough, that we needed a film strip and we needed an instructor's manual.
In other words, a package that
well,
consisted of the film strip, and a
the audio
manual.
Visual unit.
Mm-hmm.
And once you had seen the motion picture, the film strip would review the key points and allow you to study certain things. The manual would also allow you to review it too, but the film strip was a basic reviewer.
Right. Well, you know, I just want to interject one thing, Floyd. We'll come back to this, I'm sure, later. But, you know, after the war, Al Rosenberg tried that with text films at McGraw-Hill. He used to produce the film, a series of slides, or a film strip to go with the film in the manual. It never quite caught on, but it was interesting that you were doing that at that time.
Well, it's equally interesting that Al Rosenberg, after considerable difficulty, was on our staff.
That's interesting. Mm-hmm.
And I think if you were to talk to Al, he would tell you that most of everything he learned about motion picture production, he learned while he was working in the USOE. Because, you see, how many people have had a chance to work on 100 different motion pictures?
The project is amazing when you think of it in those terms.
Well, let's look at it another way. For 5 solid years, starting in January 40 to June 30th, 45, 4.5 years, 4.5 times 12 is 54 months. For 54 months, we turned out 5 reels of sound motion picture every week, 64 picture, two film strips of 60 frames each, and 2 printed illustrated manuals of 16 pages each, for every week for 4.5 years.
That's an incredible production record. How much staff did you have under you at that time, directly in the office?
There again, you see, it is very hard to say, because you get things done. Now, we needed an office in New York City. Obviously, it didn't make sense for the people working with the 5 producers in New York City to always come back to Washington and so forth. So we set up an office in New York City. We also set up an office in Chicago, and we also set up an office in Los Angeles. So I had 4 offices: Washington, Chicago, Los Angeles, and New York. Now, the government officially only had 1 office. I want you to know, and I don't know whether it's good for young people to know these things, but it's human, and everybody saw the need of it. Even the GSA and even the federal attorneys knew it. The office rent and the secretary in New York City was paid for by animation, supposedly, by a producer.
Well,
for animation that never occurred in any motion picture.
I see. Mm-hmm.
You see how we worked it?
Yes.
We would come to you as an old producer and say, look, this is going to cost so much. We'll authorize so many feet of grade A or grade C animation. And we'd figure out what the office cost was in terms of feet of animation and pay it. Now, that's how we handled all 3 offices.
Of course, that's really possible only when you're in a business that really is composed of members that know each other. It's small enough that it's sort of clubby in that way, and at that time it was.
It was clubby. And you may believe me, we had to be clubby. Well, the mere task of getting machines upon which to make film became, at times, almost impossible. For example, where in the dickens do you find a gear hopper during wartime to cut a helical gear on it? We found an operator, a plant over in Brooklyn, where the operator was sick and they couldn't get a substitute. So that film was shot on the night shift, which started at 10 o'clock at night and stopped at 6 o'clock in the morning. And it took us 2 weeks to shoot it. Of course, the company was kind. The man got well and came back and could have worked the last 2 nights, but they did allow us to hang on long enough just to finish up the film, but that's where it was shot. When we shot the gear indexing head, which, as you know, determines the bevel, the slant, and the number of gears.
Or teeth.
Yes. You see, it's quite a trick to put in a 6-inch slug and to have it come out with 13 teeth.
Mm-hmm.
You see? Your indexing head does that.
Right.
Well, on an indexing head, we had a special off-duty motorcycle cop to pick that up and to bring that in from the shop whenever it was free. Nobody was there to run the machine, or they were running a job that they didn't need it. It took us 2 weeks to shoot that film, and it cost us extra money. But the producer had his crew always standing by, ready to shoot when the indexing head showed up.
That's incredible.
Well, and we were dogged with all sorts of difficulties. I mean, we had to account for every piece of film. And I was allocated, and it was assumed, and of course it was 35 millimeter stock, that I was allowed 3,000 feet for each one reel of film.
Now, I think we ought to establish that one reel was roughly 400 feet.
You're talking 16.
Oh, and 35.
Most of mine were shot in 35.
That's right.
That would be 1,000 feet.
1,000 feet. All right.
You see?
So you had a shooting ratio allocated officially of 3 to 1.
That's right. Now, we also decided that the program was going to be pioneering. So a certain percentage of films were put into 16. Calvin Company, Art Studio, Photo and Sound in California were all 16 millimeter productions. And, well, again, coming back to this film business, the farm section wanted us to make a film on how to shoe a horse. Well, obviously, you had to get a horse that needed shoeing. And Calvin Company were a good, honest, sincere, hard-working, very competent company, but they really wanted to fancy it up a little bit. So they built a mock barn, hayloft, and they got some chickens around to make it look lifelike. You see it in the barnyard. And then of all the horses they found a big Clydesdale. Now, unless you know country horses, you don't know what a Clydesdale is. The Clydesdale is a kind of horses that they use in this big Bury wagon.
Right, the Budweiser team.
Yes, the Budweiser team. They generally weigh pretty close to a ton, you see. And they're huge beasts. They're gentle, but, gee, they're big. So they got this Clydesdale. Well, you see, on a set of that kind, they would throw about between 25 and 35,000 watts of light. Well, when they turned on the lights, the shoer, the blacksmith, had got the rear leg up, the hoof between his legs, ready to start and trim the hoof. They turned on the lights. They said, shoot, let her roll. They turned on the lights, and when they turned on the lights and the heat hit these chickens, they flew up. They scared the horse. The horse reared back. He stepped on a camera, and he smashed 12 cans of fresh film and carried half the set down the street.
They should have had a Shetland pony.
Well, I hope you people will always understand the difficulties of Brooker appearing before the film board, allocation board, and explaining that I needed 8 more cans of film because a horse had stepped on 8 cans. And, of course, the camera was busted, too. But this sort of thing always happened. Well, another time, the Liberty ships were going to sea with only 22 toilets. They had an allocation of 280 men. They were supposed to have 80 toilets. Now, the reason that they did not have more toilets was that the toilet is a solid vitreous china fixture, no metal in it, is set on top of a kind of guck or goo or tarry substance. But then it has to be bolted down to the steel deck, solid enough to make it rigid, but not so solid as to crack it.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the green people, the untrained people who were putting this in, weren't quite aware of just how much you had to turn it to get a seal and not crack it.
Oh.
So we were losing 80 out of every 100 toilets by somebody cracking them, tightening them down too tight. So we made a motion picture on that. Well, this time we used a toilet which one whole side had been cracked off.
Mm-hmm.
But we could use the other side, you see.
Right.
So we set it up, and of all things, and of course we couldn't kick about it, they gave us a girl plumber. Girl plumbers during the war were about as rare as what we would say hen's teeth in a cow shed. But nevertheless, and she was beautiful, believe me. But she was a good plumber. She knew all the wrenches, And she knelt over and we started the cameras rolling. She began to tighten the nut. In the meantime, we cut to some animation showing the strains and stresses on the vitreous fixture. And, well, sir, there was a professional came up at the tail end, a professional boss of the job, and he said, "I never saw such a tough piece of vitreous. That should have broken 20 minutes ago." But again, we cranked for 40 minutes on the camera before the thing broke. Well, the film, we don't show 40 minutes of it. But again, I had to go back to the film board and explain that we were making a film on a toilet and it wouldn't break, and so we cranked for 40 minutes to catch the time when it did break. So after a while, the film allocation board used to sigh whenever they saw me coming, because I would have the series of the most cockeyed complaints that they had ever heard or dreamed of. Another time, I had a bunch of film lost when one of our drivers drove his car into the river, and that didn't add to my veracity. Incidentally, as just a little side issue to all of this, you know how critical the general public in Congress is sometimes when they see studies being made on the love life of beetles, you might say. I could imagine what would happen to us if we printed a title, How to Tighten Toilets. And
what did you title it?
The setting of vitreous fixtures in rigid structures.
Now, you're violating your own precept that you mentioned before, that the title of the film should tell you exactly what's in it.
Well, it is a smart man who knows when and where to violate his own rules.
It's an incredible experience, and of course, in addition to the amazing job of getting all the props and getting all of the locations and approving the setups ahead of time, you also had to run back and forth to Washington to explain to the film board why a horse stepped in the film cans and why a car fell into the river and why a toilet bowl didn't break.
Well, I was always on the spot for half a dozen reasons. And I think it could be said now. We put a film crew into a big California shipbuilding yard in which every last member of the crew was an FBI agent. And I was running around with two phonies trying to pretend what we were shooting, looking through viewfinders and all the rest of this in order to cover up for the fact that they were FBI agents, and we were just simply a cover-up for them to find some sabotage.
Did they?
Yes, they did. And the sabotage was frankly a very important brass part. These fellows were sticking it in their pockets and carrying it off and selling it by the weight to a competitive shipyard down the way, because this particular brass fixture was very difficult to get and was very scarce. And the federal government was allocating, let us say they needed 20 per ship. Okay, they got exactly 20. But can you imagine what would happen if somebody lost one or banged one up? Then another yard would need it, and they'd pay high premium prices to get it.
Right.
And, there was another big difficulty which occurred early in the game was the question of, were these films eligible to be purchased by the major manufacturers for training of their own staff and their own crews? And if they were to be considered text materials, could they be added to their costs of production? Well, this was the key question. If they could be added to the cost of production, and most of the war contracts were cost plus, then it meant that if they spent $100, just using round figures, on training films and training projectors, they could not only collect the $100, but they could probably get a 10%, it was cost plus percentage, and if it were 10%, they could get another $10 for having bought it.
Right, but if it was money out of their pockets, then they would be reluctant to use this technique as a training
Well, they couldn't
device.
list it as a cost.
Right.
This required a long series of negotiations with the Attorney General's office, Eventually, representatives of the Motion Picture Producers Distributors Association were brought in. Eventually, representatives of the National Education Association, the U.S. Office of Education, and of the American Council of Education were all brought in. But eventually, the Attorney General at that time, Biddle, ruled that the training films should be considered identical in every legal fashion with training textbooks, which meant, one, that they could be charged as a legitimate cost to the production of war materials like tanks and so forth and so on. It also meant that, two, we could depend on all 16 millimeter and all 35 millimeter non-theatrical film producers was assured of cameras, allocations of film, and all the other necessary metals that they needed for production. It also meant that the whole film industry, non-theatrical educational film industry, was kept alive, because they could now get stock, they could sell projectors, and they could sell. And so the decision was one of the most far-reaching decisions ever reached. And I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say that it kept the whole non-theatrical film industry going full blast, and this included the educational films, all during the war period.
And developing a body of expertise and practice that was extremely important after the war.
That's right.
You know, that question of textbooks versus films or materials being defined as textbooks plagues us still today in the state adoption of textbooks. It was only a few years ago that films were able to be adopted in a couple of states as under the same rubric as textbooks. But anyhow, it is interesting to see, and we really don't appreciate how a legal interpretation can make all the difference in the world.
Well, until that time, the schools had stopped the manufacture of 16 millimeter projectors. And schools couldn't buy them, even though they wanted to give training programs. It was at least not until June 1940 that this question was resolved. And until that time, there was no steel allocated. Bell & Howell couldn't even turn out lenses.
That's interesting.
You see.
And then
Victor Animatograph closed down because they could get no steel. And they tried to issue a few films on tin reels and cardboard boxes. But that wasn't too successful. Tin doesn't hold up too well, and cardboard boxes certainly weren't very good for travel or moving around in those days. Well, the end of that was still not yet, because the very minute that the Attorney General ruled that training films were the same as textbooks, then this gave legitimacy to the audiovisual specialist.
Right.
So the civil service had to come up with a whole new program of establishing job criteria, job levels, and job classifications for audiovisual specialists. This meant, furthermore, that archives had to set up a film division to receive government films for the archives. It meant also that the Library of Congress had to set up a film division with film experts, because now they would be receiving films for copyright purposes. Now, the end of this story is not yet, because the definition we used with the Attorney General was the definition that was later incorporated in the first international treaty for the free passage of films without payment of duty. And that treaty included records. This was the first film recommended and passed by the General Assembly of UNESCO, United Nations Educational, Cultural, Scientific Organization, in Paris, and was sent to all the countries to ratify, and it was the first international treaty of UNESCO that was ratified and put into operation.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit, Floyd, about the problems of distribution at that time of the films that you were producing.
Well, first of all, as I indicated, we had decided to distribute through a commercial distributor. And he got this on a bid contract. Now, we drew up the strictest of all specifications possible for the laboratory work in which he had to meet. Now, the distribution started out with Castle Films in New York City. They won the first contract, and if I remember correctly, they had that contract up until in the middle 60s, when Consolidated Lab got it for a couple of years, and then Norwood.
Mm-hmm.
And now, of course, it's been taken over by the National Audiovisual Service of the General Services Administration, and it's now a government function. But very early in the game, we became aware of a lot of films that the armed services were making, which could be useful in schools, like one on the cathode ray oscilloscope. And then became the struggle to get the Navy to release such materials for use under the Castle contract. And obviously, they were all classified. But as we pointed out before the Admiral, Mustenberg, if the Germans didn't know all about the cathode ray oscilloscope, we were dumber than we thought they were. And he agreed that the cathode ray oscilloscope was no secret to anybody. And I said, well, so long as the government's paid for these, why shouldn't the war trainees and the students of the country be able to use them? Well, he said it mustn't cost us anything. I said it won't. We'll even pay for the dupe, but that's all we'll pay for. And so eventually we were distributing films produced by 9 federal agencies. And of course we passed on them ourselves as to whether or not we considered them educational for training. And we weren't interested in making just any film. Another angle of this was the problem of utilization on the end of the line. We got a complaint from the Brooklyn Technical School that the films were being printed too dark. And because the head of the school was a friend of
Was this
Steinfelder,
high school or college?
This was, no, Brooklyn Tech.
Brooklyn Technical High School.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Because he was a friend of the assistant commissioners, I had to go up to New York myself. And come to find out, they were shooting the film on a brick wall that was painted battleship gray. And I said to him, I said,
Not the best of screens.
Didn't anybody ever tell you needed a screen? Why, he said, no, what's that? Well, I had him go across town and buy a screen and come back. Well, he said, this makes all the difference in the world. Why didn't somebody tell me about this?
And this was a Brooklyn Technical High School.
That's right. But this was the only projector they ever had in the school.
Mm-hmm. Well, if that happened at Brooklyn Technical High School, there must have been worse things happening at other places that didn't have that kind of background.
They did. And we always heard about them. And it got so, though, that I began to have a series of people that I knew in various towns. When anything went wrong around St. Louis, I called up Libby Golderman and said, Libby, would you please come over to this plant? And I would tell the plant that she was coming, you see. And she'd go over and she'd call me up later, collect, and tell me it was the silliest thing. They simply hadn't turned the switch.
Right.
And, Margaret DeVizia helped me an awful lot in the Los Angeles area. Same way. And other people in the San Francisco area and in Detroit. The audiovisual person there, I've forgotten his name.
In Detroit?
Yes. He was a big help. He would send some of his staff out to Ford or Chrysler or to the big bomber production plant out at Willow Run.
That wasn't Art Stenius, was it?
No, that was prior to Stenius. Stenius was not in the school system. Stenius was at Wayne.
Oh, right. Mm-hmm.
But these are all part of the stories. And, of course, there's many other aspects of this program that I haven't covered as yet. One of them is the relationship with Congress. Mm-hmm. And the time that we had to make a demand appearance before old Senator McKellar from Tennessee. You remember the time when they were investigating whether or not all these government film agencies were turning out films trying to support Roosevelt?
Right, yes.
And at that time, they closed down the Millet's office, the Office of War Information. because they had seen the pictures of Roosevelt in a couple of the films. And so they closed it down. That's the time when Paul Reed moved over from OFI, Office of War, OWI, Office of War Information, to the U.S. Office of Education. And
It's an interesting aspect that I think we all have tended to forget.
well,
And of course, McKellar was a Democrat.
when McKellar called me up, he said, "You running a film department?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Are you making any propaganda films in favor of that man in the White House?" I said, "I am not aware, Senator, that we're making any propaganda films. We're simply making training films." Well, he said, "I want you to bring up some of them and show them to me and my committee tomorrow at 2:30. I said, "Yes, sir." This is the way you always handle senators. And it's damn surprising that the call from the senator came to me. I later discovered the Studebaker had told him to call me. But anyway. The next day, I loaded up every film we had produced at that time, and we only had 60 of them. And went up, and first of all, the guards wouldn't allow me in the gate because they had never seen a contraption like the motion picture projector.
They thought you were going to blow the place
The
up.
more they looked at it, the more convinced they were that I wasn't too good a citizen. Because they looked at that equipment, they couldn't figure out what in the target it was for. And so finally at last they called up Senator Keller. I said, "Look, would you call him, please? Because I'm being delayed and I'm going to be late, and I promised him I would be there at 2:30. He said, "You really want us to call Keller?" I said, "Certainly I do, and tell him exactly what's happening down here." They called up and, well, they said, Keller said that Mr. Brooker was okay and whatever he's bringing along was required. So I went in. And I got up there and there's Senator Kellerton. Kellerton said, "Now, young man," he said, "you have any propaganda?" I said, "Senator, this is a perfectly honest deal. Here's all the pictures we produced today. You take your pick." And of course, what he picked was, of all things, was setting keel blocks and bottom cradle on a ship. Well, you know anything about the keel blocks and bottom cradle on a ship?
I know what they look like.
Well, you know how dead and dull it can be unless you're a shipbuilder. And figuring out the 3/8 inch slant per foot on the whole dry dock, you know. Well, Senator Keller, that film ran 27 minutes. And at the end of 20 minutes, Keller said, "Young man, are they all like this?" I said, "I think so." He said, "You don't have any characters in any of them?" "Well," I said, "we had characters in that. We had the machinist that was setting the keel track." "Oh," he said, "I don't mean those boys. I mean characters." I said, "No, sir, none of one. They don't belong in a training film. We have mechanics, we have trained, skilled artisans." Well, he said, "You get your stuff and get the hell out of here. I declare the meeting dismissed." And he woke up 3/4 of the senators that was sitting in the room.
Not a picture of Roosevelt in it.
No place.
No place.
And there was no reason for them to expect one to pop up all of a sudden.
Right.
Well, can you imagine anything more incongruous than all of a sudden going into the Stars and Stripes Forever March and then a picture of Roosevelt? Nah.
Well, of course, that also would reinforce what we know was the image of a film to these people. There was either entertainment or propaganda.
That's right.
Well-
And there's a lot more to this, and I'm sorry I'm going to have to
Well-
cut this short.
Okay, could you just give me one last, just a quick summary of how you look at the impact of the program that you headed during World War II on the post-war development of films and education? What was
Well,
the key thing? Was
here's
it
the key
personnel,
thing.
companies?
Here's a key thing. We had altogether 20 million men in the armed forces, and all of them were trained with films. Some of the training was ridiculous. Well, I'll explain that. At one point in the war, they decided that there were too many motion pictures for all the soldiers to see. So the brass went down the list of films, and they selected 57 films that every soldier should see. So they sent out the wires all over the country to all the forts and the training places. The general out in charge of Fort Hays in Columbus looked at this list of films. He figured out that the biggest place he had on the whole post was the mess hall. So he had breakfast served at 5 o'clock, and by running them at 5-hour lots, all the men by midnight that night could see all 57 films. And they saw them one right after the other for 5.5 hours each sitting. But he was the most pleased commander you ever saw in the country, because he sent a telegram back to the War Department that night: order so-and-so received, order executed. And we audiovisual people always said executed. That was really the word for it.
Right.
Now, let's look at this. 20 million people in the armed forces were all trained with films. At least another 15 to 20 million people in industrial war industries were trained. They now came home, the soldiers and the sailors and the Marine, and they took films for granted.
I regret to say that this interview with Floyd Brooker was never finished. The tape ran out at the point where Floyd stops talking, and he said he was tired and would like to postpone the rest of the interview until the next day. Well, as you might have anticipated, the next day he was ill and then had to leave town. Later, when I asked Lou Sachs in Detroit if he could finish the interview, he tried to contact Floyd, but Floyd, in the meantime, had died. However, most of Floyd's story had been told on the tape, and he was going to talk about how the wave of GIs and industrial workers, all of whom had been trained using films, expected films to be used en masse in education. And there was a good deal of impetus given to the use of audiovisual materials in the schools as a result of the experiences in World War II. This concludes this interview with Floyd Brooker.